This is 8th grade math, Unit 1, Lesson 2, Naming the Moves. Our learning goals, our learning targets for this lesson, we want to be able to identify corresponding points before and after a transformation. And we also want to know the difference between translations, rotations, and reflections. So we're going to start out with our first task. It gives us a couple of quadrilaterals here. It says quadrilateral A can be rotated into the position of quadrilateral B. Estimate the angle of rotation. So if I'm just looking at taking this figure A and turning it until it lines up with this figure B, well, it looks to me like it's turning around this point where they're connected right here. Now, we would call this point where they're connected the center of rotation because that's where we're turning the figure around. That's the point it's spinning around. If I want to try to estimate how far I am turning this figure, I want to look for my corresponding points. So, for example, I noticed that in this figure A, let me see if it'll let me put a point here, the very tip, right, the longest part of this pointy part right here, I'm going to put a point there and call that C. Now, in figure B, I need to be able to find where this point ended up after I rotated my figure. Well, when I look at figure B, I notice that the long pointy part, right, ended up down here. So the corresponding point from our original point C is going to be here at this point labeled D, right? When I took this figure and I rotated it, this point C landed where point D is. Well, I also notice, I'm going to use my pen tool here. I also noticed that this whole line would rotate to end up on top of this whole line, right? The longest line from the original figure is what ended up right here to give us the longest line in the new figure. So when I'm looking to estimate an angle of rotation, if I'm actually trying to measure that angle of rotation, I'm trying to measure this angle that has been created. So I've got my point C and point D, which is where point C ended up after the rotation. I also said that this point where they were connected, I'm going to label that point E, that point was our center of rotation. And so what I'm really trying to measure here is how much of a turn has happened to get this line segment CE over here to where this line segment DE is. So segment CE is corresponding with DE. They're in the same position in both of those figures. So I'm just going to grab my protractor here, and I'm going to use my protractor. I'm going to line it up with the center of rotation, and then I'm just going to turn it until this line that's pointing at the 180 right here, or the one that's kind of pointing at 0, until this bottom line right here is lined up with DE. Okay, so there's approximately my angle of rotation, and I can tell that this is open. When I look at my protractor, it looks like it's more than 90 degrees at about 120 degrees. So a good estimation for the angle of rotation there would be about 120 degrees. All right, on to the next task. This should be task number 2. It gives us another set of dance moves. So this is very similar to what we did in lesson 1. It says use the black points to move the frames and the open circles to rotate them. So in this one, we're just kind of looking at how is the shape changing to get from one frame to the next, right? What do we actually have to do? What kind of movements are happening? Okay, so for each movement from frame 1 to frame 2, from frame 2 to frame 3, etc., right? From one frame to the next, we're just going to type out a description of how it's moving. Now, from frame 1 to frame 2, if I kind of overlay those on top of each other, right, I can see that all that's really happened there is the figure has slid. It was over in the left bottom corner. Now it's over in the right bottom corner. We were calling that a slide in the last lesson, right? So I'm going to say from frame 1 to frame 2, the figure slides to the right. All right, well then from frame 2 to frame 3, if I take frame 2 and I lay it over here on top of frame 3, oh, okay, so I noticed that it's almost like it slid back to the left, but now it's facing a new direction. Well, the other type of movement that we had in the last lesson was a turn or a rotation. So let's see if I can turn this figure and make it face the way that it should be facing. Oh, hold on, let me turn. Grab frame 2. I don't want to get them out of order here. If I grab frame 2, okay, so I'm just going to kind of turn frame 2 until I think it's facing the same way as it is in frame 3. Okay, so there's 90 degrees. There's 180 degrees. 270, and now I'm back all the way to where I started at 360 degrees. So a turn is not going to get me facing the same way as I need it to be facing here in frame 3. So that means that this must be a new move, right? So I'm going to say that this is the new move from frame 3 to frame 4. Well, it's facing a different direction, right? So if I have my frame 3 and frame 4, I'm going to take frame 3 and see if I can turn it until my figure is facing the same way as it is here in frame 4. Well, look, there it is. Okay, so it looks like we've taken the figure and we have turned it. So I'm going to call this one a turn or a rotation. I'm going to say we turned it 90 degrees. Well, the movement that I had to make, right, from the original position right here to the way that it's facing right here, that was 90 degrees clockwise. Okay, now I'm going to look at frame 4 to frame 5. So let me put frame 3 back. From frame 4 to frame 5, we have taken the figure. It's still facing the same way it was facing. We just slid up to that top corner, right? So I'm going to say from frame 4 to frame 5, we slide up. All right, and then from frame 5 to frame 6, well, I kind of run into the same issue that I had before from frame 2 to frame 3. I can see that it's not just a slide, but when I try to take frame 5 and I try to rotate it, I try to turn it so that the figures are facing the same way, I run into a problem there. They don't. They don't ever face the same way. So this one must be a new move, right? We've talked about slides and turns, but if I want to get from frame 5 to frame 6, I'm going to need a new way to describe that movement. Well, when I look at the actual movement that's happening there, it really just almost looks like it's a mirror image of itself. And when I look at frame 2 and frame 3, it was that same kind of thing. It's more like a mirror image. So I think I'm going to call this one either a mirror or a flip. And either one of those would be great. So I would describe this as a flip or a mirror image. Okay, moving on to our next task. This one's a card sort. So we're going to drag the cards to sort them into categories according to the type of move they show. So if we think about the type of moves that we have, right? We had our new one, a flip or a mirror image. We had the two that we talked about yesterday, the slides or the turns. So I'm trying to put together the cards that show the same type of movements. I think I want a little bit more space, so I'm going to go full screen. Well, that didn't give me a whole lot more space, did it? All right, so I'm going to look at the first card here. I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to try to put these into categories. So when I look at card number 1, well, that looks to me like it's some kind of a slide. I'm not changing the way that that figure is facing. So when I start looking for all of the other ones where I have my two figures, they're facing the same direction as each other. All we did was slide them. I almost think of that like a copy and paste. I'm going to put 7 with 1 because that shows a figure just being slid. I think I'm going to put 8 over here with 1 because that shows a figure just being slid. And when I start looking at the options I have left, do you see any more slides? Oh, here's one, number 10. Okay, so I have 1, 7, 8, and 10 together in a group. All right, I'm going to move some of these out of the way. Let's do card number 2. Looks to me like that one is a turn, right? It's kind of like we're spinning that green figure around. We're spinning it around this point right here until it's upside down facing the same way that this one is, right? So because it looks like a spin or a turn, I'm going to go see if I can find some more turns to put those together with. Okay, number 9. That one looks like a turn, to me at least. Number 6, I think that one looks like a turn. And here's one, number 12. I think that one looks like a turn. All right, so I have 2, 9, 6, and 12 together. All right, so then my other category, because I could only have 3 categories, should be a flip, right, or a mirrored image. Those are like our new moves. I think number 3, right, we can see that that one's kind of a mirrored image. When I look at number 5, that one's a mirrored image. Number 4 and number 11 are actually also mirrored images. And it looks at first like maybe they might be a turn, but if you think about a diagonal line being drawn there, if I flip this green figure over a diagonal line here, then it's going to land on top of this figure. And if these were physical cards on paper, then we could fold them along this diagonal line, this little invisible diagonal line, and the 2 shapes would line up. All right, so I think I have my 3 categories. I've got my slides, I've got my turns, and I've got my flips, slides, turns, and flips. I'm going to take a minute and just describe each category. All right, so I said for the slides, they are different from the others because they don't change the way the figure is facing. It's like a copy and paste. I said for the turns, they are different from the other categories because they're turning the figure around a point. It's like a spin. And then for the flips, I said that they were different from the others because it was like a mirror image. We could draw a line of symmetry in the middle of the 2 shapes. All right, so our first 3 cards that we looked at in the card sort, card 1, 2, and 3, we're going to look at just a little bit more closely to kind of see the movement there. So on card 1, we're going to show, and you can kind of see with this little arrow right here, we started with the blue figure, and then it slid up to where the green figure was, right? So we can see that motion that's happening there. That's the slide. Card 2, that one was a turn. I can take the blue figure and I'm going to spin it around that yellow point until it lines up exactly on top of where that green figure was, right? So if I go 360 degrees, I'm back where I started. This was about half of that, so I'm going to say that this is approximately a 180-degree turn. All right, and then the last one, card number 3. This one was a flip. If I click on show image, it flips. So because of where the line of symmetry is drawn, when I flip it, it lands right on top of that green shape. But I do want you to play around with where that line is. We can kind of change the location of it. See if I change it, let's say I move it down here and make it more of a horizontal line than a vertical line, right? That blue figure, when I click show image, is going to flip down on the other side of that line. So we can kind of play around. You can make it a diagonal line and see where your blue figure ends up. You can kind of play around with the reflections there.